A black old man was kicked out of a luxury car dealership, but the manager regretted it a minute later. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. Samuel Williams had lived through nearly 8 decades, and in that time he had seen the world change in ways that were both profound and, at times, painfully slow. He was a man who had come from hardship, rising from a childhood of poverty and prejudice to build a life of quiet success. Yet, despite his wealth, he had never embraced the extravagance that many of his peers flaunted so freely. He lived in the same modest house on the outskirts of the city, a home he had purchased more than 50 years ago. The neighborhood had changed over time, the faces of the people shifting with the decades. But Samuel had remained, a quiet fixture of stability in an ever-moving world. His wealth was no secret to those who knew him well, but few truly understood the extent of it. He had built his fortune through patience, wisdom, and an unwavering belief in the power of investment. Real estate, stocks, and small business ventures had all played a role in his success, yet he had never sought recognition or admiration for his financial achievements. To Samuel, money was a tool, not a symbol of status. He did not own designer suits or luxury watches, nor did he drive flashy cars. His favorite possessions were the books that lined the shelves of his study, volumes that told the stories of history's great thinkers, revolutionaries, and dreamers. Samuel believed in using his wealth for good. Over the years, he had quietly funded scholarships for underprivileged students, donated to hospitals, and financed programs aimed at helping the homeless find stability. He had never sought to have his name attached to these efforts. His satisfaction came from knowing that his contributions were making a difference. His daughter, Rachel, had inherited his values. She was a schoolteacher, dedicating her life to educating children in underserved communities. She had never been interested in the wealth her father possessed, choosing instead to live a simple life, just as he had taught her. The only extravagance she allowed herself was the time she spent with her son, Malcolm. Malcolm was 10 years old and full of life. He had an insatiable curiosity about the world, always asking questions, always seeking to understand. But more than anything, he loved cars. His room was a shrine to the world of automobiles. Posters of Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and Bugattis adorned the walls, shelves lined with carefully arranged model cars. He knew the names of every supercar, could recite their specifications, and had memorized the history of legendary drivers. Samuel loved to indulge his grandson's passion. He would take him to car museums, tell him stories about classic races, and listen intently as Malcolm excitedly described his dream of one day driving a Ferrari. But dreams, Samuel knew, were sometimes fragile things. It had started with fatigue. Malcolm, once so full of boundless energy, began to tire more easily. He would come home from school and collapse onto the couch, his usual enthusiasm dulled by an exhaustion that could not be explained by a simple day of learning. Then came the weakness in his hands. Small things, like struggling to button his shirt or hold his pencil properly. Rachel had taken him to the doctor, hoping it was nothing more than growing pains or an iron deficiency. The diagnosis shattered them. A rare, aggressive neurological disease. It would progress quickly, the doctors said. There was no cure. There was little they could do but make him comfortable and cherish the time they had left. Samuel had faced many hardships in his life, had endured injustice, had built himself up from nothing, but nothing had ever felt as heavy as watching his grandson's bright future dim before his eyes. But Malcolm did not dwell on the unfairness of it. He still smiled, still laughed, still dreamed. And he still talked about Ferraris. Samuel knew then that there was one thing he could do. He could not give his grandson more time, but he could give him a moment. One perfect, unforgettable moment. Malcolm's dream had always been to ride in a Ferrari, to feel the power of the engine, to hear the roar of the machine that had fascinated him for as long as he could remember. Samuel decided that he would make that dream come true. He began researching, looking for the right place to buy a Ferrari. He wanted it to be special, something Malcolm would remember forever. And so, one morning, he put on his favorite hat, straightened the collar of his well-worn coat, and stepped outside. The world had changed in many ways, but Samuel had learned long ago that some things remained the same. And as he drove toward the high-end dealership in the wealthiest part of the city, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to be reminded of that truth once again. The Ferrari dealership stood like a temple of luxury in the heart of the city's wealthiest district. Towering glass walls gleamed under the late morning sun, reflecting the meticulously polished showroom floors within. The building exuded exclusivity, from the sleek, minimalistic signage to the security guards positioned discreetly near the entrance. Inside, the cars sat like rare jewels under carefully arranged lights, their sculpted bodies shimmering in hues of deep crimson, midnight black, and electric silver. Samuel Williams parked his car, a modest, well-maintained sedan, a block away from the dealership. He didn't care for valet services, nor did he feel the need to parade his financial means. He had come with a simple purpose, to buy a Ferrari for his grandson, to give Malcolm a memory that would shine even in the darkest of days ahead. As he stepped into the dealership, the shift in atmosphere was palpable. The conversations of customers and staff fell to a hushed murmur, and though no one openly stared, Samuel could feel the weight of their gazes. He had been here before, not in this showroom, not in this moment, but in countless others across his lifetime. The unspoken question hung in the air. What is he doing here? The showroom was immaculate, every surface gleaming under soft, ambient lighting. Sales associates in crisp suits moved fluidly between the vehicles, attending to affluent clientele who examined the cars with casual entitlement. Samuel walked past them, his eyes scanning the rows of automobiles until he saw it. A Ferrari 488 Spider, its bold red body reflecting the light in a way that made it seem almost alive. He moved toward it, his fingers brushing against the smooth exterior. He could already imagine Malcolm's face, his wide eyes, the awe and joy that would fill them. For a brief moment, the weight of reality lifted. Then a voice, clipped and cold, shattered the moment. "Can I help you, sir?" Samuel turned. The man addressing him was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blue suit. His hair was neatly styled, his expression practiced, polite but distant. He wore the kind of smirk that was meant to be welcoming to some and dismissive to others. "My name is Thomas," the man continued, his eyes subtly scanning Samuel's attire. The coat, though clean, showed signs of years of wear. The shoes, though polished, lacked the sheen of designer brands. "Are you looking for something in particular?" Samuel nodded toward the Ferrari. "I'd like to buy this car." For a fleeting second, Thomas's smirk faltered. Then it returned, sharpened with condescension. "Ah," he said, his tone dipping into something almost amused. "That's a beautiful choice. The 488 Spider is one of our finest models. But I should let you know, these cars aren't exactly inexpensive." "I'm aware of the price," Samuel said evenly. "Of course," Thomas replied, but his posture remained unchanged, his skepticism unmasked. Samuel had lived long enough to recognize what was happening. He had seen it in countless faces over the years. The doubt, the disbelief, the underlying assumption that he didn't belong here. "Why don't I show you something else?" Thomas suggested smoothly. "We have a few pre-owned models that might be—" "I'm not interested in anything else," Samuel interrupted. His voice was calm but firm. "I came for this car." Thomas hesitated. He was accustomed to making quick judgments about people, assessing within seconds whether a customer was worth his time. And everything about this man, the simple clothes, the old-fashioned hat, the quiet but assured demeanor, suggested that he wasn't. "Perhaps I could arrange a test drive for you," Thomas said, still stalling, "although we do require a credit check before—" "I'll be paying in full," Samuel cut in, his patience thinning. "Today." For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed Thomas's face. He glanced around the showroom, as if expecting someone else to intervene, someone to confirm that this was, in fact, a misunderstanding. When no such person materialized, his expression hardened. "I see," Thomas said coolly. "I'll have to check with my manager about that." Before Samuel could respond, Thomas turned and walked away. But he did not go toward an office, nor toward another associate. He walked directly to the front desk, where the security guard stood. Samuel exhaled slowly, pressing his hands into the pockets of his coat. He had been here before. He had walked into places where he was unwelcome, where his presence was questioned before a single word had been exchanged. And yet, no matter how many times he encountered it, there was always that familiar sting. The security guard, a large man in a black suit, approached a moment later, his expression carefully neutral. "Sir," he said, his voice slow, measured, "is there a problem here?" Samuel turned fully to face him. "Not at all," he replied. "I was just speaking with one of your salesmen about buying a car." The guard's eyes flicked to Thomas, who was watching from a few feet away, arms crossed. There was a silent exchange between them, one that Samuel recognized all too well. "I think maybe you should come back another time," the guard said. Samuel remained still. He could have argued. He could have demanded to speak to someone else. But he knew how this game was played. He had fought enough battles to know that some were not worth waging. Not in this way, not on this day. He gave one last glance at the Ferrari, the car that would have made Malcolm's heart soar, before turning toward the exit. As he walked away, Thomas's voice followed him. "Maybe next time, sir," he said with that same thinly veiled smirk, "if you're serious about making a purchase." Samuel didn't look back. The cold air outside was a stark contrast to the warmth of the showroom, but it was not the temperature that made his breath feel heavy in his chest. He reached for his car keys, fingers tightening around them. This was not the end of it. He had come here with a purpose, and he would see it through. One way or another, he would make his grandson's dream come true. Samuel stood outside the dealership for a moment, allowing the cold air to settle the frustration burning in his chest. He had lived long enough to know that anger would do him no good, but that didn't make it any less difficult to swallow. He had expected some resistance, some level of prejudice. It was a familiar tune, one he had heard all his life, and yet, every time it played, it still had the power to sting. He exhaled, his breath curling into the winter air. This wasn't over. He had promised Malcolm, and a promise to his grandson was one he would not break. Just as he was about to step off the curb and head back to his car, a voice called out behind him. "Sir, please wait." Samuel turned to see a young man hurrying toward him. He was in his mid-20s, sharply dressed like the other salesmen, but without the air of superiority they carried. His suit fit well, but there was no stiffness in his posture, no cold calculation in his gaze. His skin was a warm brown, and Samuel recognized something in his expression, concern, perhaps even shame. "I saw what happened," the young man said as he caught up to Samuel, "and I wanted to say I'm sorry." Samuel studied him for a moment before speaking. "You don't need to apologize for something you didn't do." The young man shook his head. "I do, though. That was wrong. The way he treated you, it was unacceptable." Samuel sighed. "It wasn't the first time, son, and I doubt it'll be the last." The young man nodded solemnly, then extended a hand. "My name's Jason. I work here, and if you're still interested in that Ferrari, I'd really like to help you." Samuel hesitated. He had been ready to leave, ready to find another way. But there was something in Jason's voice that made him pause, an earnestness that felt rare in places like this. "Why?" Samuel asked simply. Jason met his gaze without flinching. "Because it's the right thing to do." That, at least, was an answer Samuel could respect. He nodded slowly. "All right, Jason, let's try this again." Jason led him back inside, and the shift in atmosphere was immediate. The other salesmen stole glances, whispering among themselves, while Thomas, still near the front desk, scowled openly. Jason ignored them, guiding Samuel past the showroom floor and toward a private office. "Gimme just a second," Jason said as he stepped inside, leaving Samuel in the hallway. Through the glass window, Samuel saw Jason speaking with a woman seated behind a sleek wooden desk. She was in her 60s, her silver hair neatly styled, her posture upright with an air of quiet authority. She listened as Jason spoke, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. Then, after a brief pause, she stood and walked to the door. She was shorter than Samuel had expected, but there was no mistaking the weight of her presence. As she extended a hand, her voice was warm but firm. "Mr. Williams, my name is Margaret Holloway. I own this dealership." Samuel shook her hand. Her grip was strong, confident. "Jason just told me what happened out there," she continued, "and I want to start by offering you my sincerest apologies." Samuel studied her for a moment before replying. "I appreciate that, Miss Holloway, but an apology only means something if it's followed by action." Margaret nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I couldn't agree more." She glanced towards the showroom where Thomas still lingered near the front desk. "Would you excuse me for just a moment?" Samuel stepped aside as she walked past him, moving with a purpose that suggested she had made up her mind before she had even left her office. She stopped in front of Thomas, who straightened at the sight of her, his smirk faltering. Samuel couldn't hear their conversation, but he didn't need to. He saw the way Thomas's expression shifted from surprise to indignation, the way his posture stiffened, the way his mouth opened as if to argue, only for Margaret to cut him off with a single, sharp motion of her hand. It was over in less than a minute. Thomas turned abruptly and stalked toward the exit, his jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides. He didn't look at Samuel as he passed. Margaret exhaled as she returned. "He's no longer employed here," she said simply. "We have no room for that kind of behavior in my business." Samuel gave a slow nod. "That's a good start." Margaret motioned toward the office. "Please, come inside. Let's talk." Samuel followed her in, taking a seat across from her desk as Jason stood nearby. "You came here today to buy a Ferrari," Margaret said. "May I ask who it's for?" Samuel hesitated only briefly. "My grandson, Malcolm. He's 10 years old. Loves cars more than anything. He stopped, swallowing down the weight in his throat. "He's sick. Not much time left. His dream is to ride in a Ferrari. Margaret's expression softened, the steel in her demeanor giving way to something gentler. Jason, standing to the side, looked down, his jaw tightening. "I see," Margaret said quietly. For a moment, she was silent, as if considering something. Then she spoke again, her voice steady but kind. "Mr. Williams, I'd like to offer you the car as a gift, no charge." Samuel blinked. He had expected fairness, not charity. "I appreciate the offer," he said, "but that won't be necessary. I came here to buy a car. I intend to pay for it." Margaret studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I respect that." She glanced at Jason. "Let's make sure this is the smoothest sale we've ever had." Jason grinned. "Yes, ma'am." The paperwork took time, but there were no more obstacles, no more questions about whether he could afford it. Jason handled everything personally, ensuring that every detail was handled with efficiency and care. When the final documents were signed, he handed Samuel the keys with a broad smile. "It's all yours, Mr. Williams." Samuel took the keys, feeling their weight in his palm. He had done it. "Thank you, Jason," he said sincerely, "and you too, Miss Holloway." Margaret inclined her head. "I should be thanking you, Mr. Williams. Today was a reminder of what truly matters." Samuel stood, slipping the keys into his pocket. "There's just one last thing I need to do," he said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Samuel smiled. "Take this car to my grandson." Jason's grin widened. "Would you like some help delivering it?" Samuel chuckled. "I think I'd like that." As they walked toward the showroom, the Ferrari waiting for him in all its gleaming perfection, Samuel felt something settle inside him. A quiet satisfaction, a steady certainty. Malcolm's dream was about to come true, and that, Samuel knew, was worth more than anything. The Ferrari 488 Spider sat gleaming in the dealership's delivery bay, its deep red body reflecting the afternoon light. Samuel ran his fingers along its smooth curves, feeling the cold metal beneath his touch. He could already picture the way Malcolm's eyes would light up when he saw it. Jason stood beside him, checking the final delivery details. "Everything's set, Mr. Williams. Do you want to drive it yourself, or would you like me to follow you to the hospital in case you need anything?" Samuel looked at him, a small smile playing on his lips. "I appreciate that, son, but I think this is something I need to do myself." Jason nodded. "Understood. If you need anything, you've got my number." Samuel took the keys, slid into the driver's seat, and took a deep breath. The interior smelled of fine leather, the steering wheel firm beneath his hands. He turned the key, and the engine roared to life with a deep, guttural growl. It was a sound that commanded attention, a sound that would make any car enthusiast's heart race. He pulled out of the dealership, easing the Ferrari onto the main road. The engine purred beneath him, powerful yet controlled. It had been years since he had driven a car with this much power, but his hands were steady, his focus sharp. As he navigated through the city streets, he found himself reflecting on everything that had brought him to this moment. The battles he had fought, the prejudices he had endured, the quiet victories he had won. And now, here he was, about to give his grandson a moment of pure joy. The hospital was only a short drive away, but every red light, every delay felt like an eternity. He tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, eager to see Malcolm's reaction. When he finally arrived, he pulled up right in front of the hospital entrance. The Ferrari idled smoothly, its presence drawing the attention of passers-by. Doctors, nurses, and patients alike paused to admire the luxury car that had no business being in a hospital driveway. Samuel stepped out, adjusting his hat as he looked up at the building. He had spent too much time here over the past few months, watching as the grandson he adored grew weaker with each visit. But today was different. Today was about joy. Inside, Rachel was sitting beside Malcolm's bed, reading softly from a book. She looked up as Samuel entered, her face lighting up with surprise. "Dad, what are you doing here so early?" Samuel smiled. "I brought something special for Malcolm." Malcolm, lying weakly in bed, turned his head toward them, his eyes tired but still full of curiosity. "Grandpa?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Samuel stepped closer, crouching beside the bed. "How would you like to go for a ride, kiddo?" Malcolm's brow furrowed. "A ride?" Samuel pulled the keys from his pocket and dangled them in front of him. "Not just any ride, son. A Ferrari ride." For a moment, there was silence. Then Malcolm's eyes widened, the realization dawning on him. "No way," he breathed. Samuel chuckled. "Oh, yes, way." Rachel covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes misting over. "Dad, you really did it?" "I made a promise," Samuel said simply. The next few minutes were a flurry of excitement. Nurses helped carefully lift Malcolm from the bed and into a wheelchair, making sure he was bundled up against the cold. He was frail, his limbs too thin, but the excitement in his eyes made him look more alive than he had in weeks. As they wheeled him outside, Malcolm's breath caught in his throat. The Ferrari was waiting, its red paint shining under the afternoon sun. He stared at it, his mouth slightly open, unable to believe what he was seeing. "Grandpa," he whispered, "it's beautiful." Samuel crouched beside him. "And it's all yours today, champ." With careful hands, they helped Malcolm into the passenger seat. He ran his fingers over the dashboard, feeling the fine leather, the precision of the craftsmanship. He touched the steering wheel reverently, as if afraid it might disappear if he blinked. Samuel slid into the driver's seat and looked over at his grandson. "Ready?" Malcolm nodded eagerly, more than ready. Samuel pressed his foot to the accelerator and the engine roared. They pulled away from the hospital, the Ferrari gliding effortlessly onto the road. Samuel kept the speed controlled, but the car's power was undeniable. The city blurred past them, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. Malcolm laughed, a full, bright laugh that Samuel hadn't heard in too long. He tilted his head back against the seat, his eyes alight with pure joy. "This is amazing," Malcolm shouted over the sound of the wind and the engine. "I can feel it in my chest." Samuel grinned, glancing over at him. "That's the power of a real supercar, kid." They drove through the city, taking scenic roads, stretching out every moment. Malcolm's face never lost its look of awe, his hands gripping the seat as he took in every second of the experience. For a little while, he wasn't a sick boy in a hospital bed. He wasn't fragile or fading. He was just a kid, living his dream. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Samuel turned back toward the hospital. He wanted to keep driving forever, to keep this moment alive, but he knew Malcolm was growing tired. When they pulled back into the hospital driveway, the nurses were waiting, along with Rachel. Malcolm's face was flushed with excitement, his eyes still shining. "That," he said breathlessly, "was the best day of my life." Samuel swallowed past the lump in his throat. He reached over and gently squeezed Malcolm's hand. "I'm glad, kiddo." As the nurses helped him back into his wheelchair, he looked back at the Ferrari one last time. "I'll never forget this, Grandpa." And Samuel knew in that moment that neither would he. No matter what came next, no matter how much time they had left, this memory would last forever. The days that followed the ride were filled with a mixture of emotions. For Malcolm, it was as if time had slowed down, allowing him to hold on to the memory of that drive, the sound of the engine, the feel of the leather seat beneath him, and the sheer exhilaration of speed. He talked about it endlessly, recounting every moment with a sparkle in his eyes that had been absent for too long. But time was a relentless force, and no matter how fiercely they clung to the joy of that day, reality continued its slow, inevitable march forward. Malcolm's condition worsened. The doctors had warned them that it would happen quickly, that his illness had reached a stage where there was little they could do but make him comfortable. Samuel sat by his grandson's bedside every day, holding his small, fragile hand, telling him stories of great racers, of legendary cars, of the roads that stretched beyond the horizon. Malcolm never stopped dreaming. Even in his weakest moments, he still whispered about the cars he would drive, the places he would go, the races he would win. And Samuel listened to every word, committing them to memory, carrying them like sacred prayers. Then, one quiet morning, just before the sun rose, Malcolm slipped away. Rachel was the first to break, her sobs filling the room as she clung to her son's lifeless body. Samuel sat beside her, his face lined with grief but his hands steady as he stroked Malcolm's small fingers one last time. There was no greater pain than outliving a child, no heavier sorrow than saying goodbye to someone who had barely begun to live. The funeral was simple. Malcolm had never liked the idea of grand ceremonies. He had always been a boy who found joy in the little things, in a well-built car, in the hum of an engine, in the stories his grandfather told him. So they honored him in the only way that made sense. Samuel arranged for the Ferrari, the very car that had brought Malcolm so much happiness, to be parked near the entrance of the small chapel where the service was held. When mourners arrived, they didn't see just grief. They saw a reminder of a dream fulfilled. They saw the bright red car shining under the daylight, a symbol of the boy who had loved it so dearly. People spoke of Malcolm's kindness, of his intelligence, of his endless curiosity. And Samuel, when it was his turn to speak, stood in front of them all, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "My grandson," he said, "lived his life with passion. He taught me that dreams, no matter how small, no matter how fleeting, matter. That even in the darkest of times, joy can be found. He may not have had the years we all wished for him, but he had something greater. He had moments that mattered. And, in the end, that's all any of us can ask for." There wasn't a dry eye in the room when he stepped down, but Samuel knew that grief alone wasn't enough to honor Malcolm's memory. He needed to do something more. A week after the funeral, Samuel found himself standing outside the Ferrari dealership once again. The last time he had been there, he had been fighting to prove that he belonged. Now, he was here for a different reason. Margaret greeted him warmly, leading him into her office. Jason was already there, sitting across from her, his expression one of quiet respect. "I wasn't sure if we'd see you again so soon, Mr. Williams," Margaret said softly. "How are you holding up?" Samuel exhaled, rubbing his hands together before he spoke. "Grief is a strange thing. It leaves you empty, but at the same time it makes you want to fill that emptiness with something meaningful. That's why I'm here." Margaret leaned forward. "What do you have in mind?" Samuel looked between them, his gaze steady. "I want to start something in Malcolm's name. A foundation. Something that will help other kids like him. Kids who don't have time, but who still have dreams." Jason's eyes widened slightly. "You mean—" "I want to give children who are sick, who don't have long, the chance to experience something special. Maybe it's a ride in a Ferrari. Maybe it's meeting their favorite athlete. Maybe it's something else entirely. But I want them to have what Malcolm had, a moment of pure happiness, something they can hold on to no matter what comes next. Margaret was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. That's a beautiful idea, Mr. Williams. Samuel reached into his coat and pulled out a checkbook. I want to start by donating enough to fund the first year. We'll work out the details, but this is something I need to do. Margaret took the check with care, but her eyes were on Samuel, not the numbers. I have no doubt we can make this happen. Jason sat back, a slow smile spreading across his face. You know, I think Malcolm would have loved this. Samuel's lips twitched upward. I think so too. And so, the Malcolm Williams Foundation was born. But it didn't stop there. As word spread about the foundation, the dealership itself began to change. Margaret made a decision that shocked even her employees. She renamed the business. No longer was it just a luxury car dealership for the wealthy elite. It became something more. The new sign went up 2 months later. Malcolm Williams Motors, where dreams come true. Underneath, a plaque was installed at the entrance bearing a simple inscription. In honor of a boy who taught us that dreams matter, no matter how much time we have. It became more than just a business. Every year, the dealership hosted special events where terminally ill children could experience the thrill of luxury cars. Test drives were arranged, racetracks were rented, and for just a little while, children who had only known hospital beds got to feel what it was like to fly down an open road. Samuel attended every event, standing in the background watching as each child's face lit up with wonder. He saw Malcolm in all of them, in their wide-eyed amazement, in their laughter, in their meanwhile, Thomas, the disgraced former manager, had fallen into obscurity after his firing. But news of Malcolm's foundation reached him, and for the first time in a long while, he found himself questioning the kind of man he had become. One evening, after much hesitation, he walked back into the dealership, not as an employee, but as a man seeking redemption. Samuel was there when he arrived. I don't expect forgiveness, Thomas said quietly, but I wanted you to know that I've changed. That day, it made me see things differently. I've been volunteering at shelters, trying to be better. Just wanted to say I'm sorry. Samuel studied him for a long time before speaking. Everyone deserves a second chance, Thomas, just like I did that day when Jason called me back inside. Margaret, after much consideration, offered Thomas a lower-level position, not as a manager, but as someone who could prove through actions, not words, that he had truly changed. And over time, he did. Years passed, but Samuel never stopped visiting the dealership, never stopped watching the children who came through its doors, never stopped remembering. One evening, long after the sun had set, he stood alone in front of the red Ferrari, the same one he had bought for Malcolm. It had been preserved in the showroom, a tribute to the boy who had loved it. He ran his fingers along the hood, just as he had that first day, and smiled. "Rest easy, kid," he whispered. "Your dream's still alive." And in the quiet hum of the city and the glow of the showroom lights, Samuel Williams knew that his grandson would never be forgotten. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Share this video with your friends, and check out more stories on the channel. See you in the next one.